Hi there, I am Inara Scott. I am the Gomo Family Professor and the Senior Associate Dean for the College of Business. So I came to the College of Business back in 2012, and I was an attorney. I practiced law. I worked for utility companies, and I've always been really deeply interested in and concerned about sustainability and environmental law. And so when I started here, I began teaching a class related to environmental law and business. And over time, I've really transitioned and I teach our students about sustainable business. And when students hear that, sometimes they say, is that really a thing? Is sustainable business really a thing? And I started doing some research into that concept. And it led me to this topic, which is sustainable capitalism, which takes the questions that students often begin with, and really just about everybody that I talk to about this. They seem to hear those two words together, and then there's immediately a question mark. So I hear sustainable capitalism, and I say, is that possible? Is capitalism contradictory to sustainability? How can those two things even possibly work together? So when we look at sustainability, it can mean a lot of different things. One way to consider what sustainability means is to ask, how are we using resources on the planet, and what does that look like for generations going forward? So are we going to be able to maintain the same amount of resources, the ability to access those resources for future generations? One way to look at that is the notion of planetary boundaries. So you can see in these three charts that there are ways that we can assess the availability of fresh water, acidification of the ocean, the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment, just to name a few. And each one of those represents a boundary. So when you look at that little green circle in the middle, that's where we want to be. That means that we are acting sustainably. We'll be able to continue to operate the world as we currently know it. And you can see over time, a lot more orange and red, and that means that we're exceeding those boundaries. So we're using more fresh water than we're replacing into the system, or the amount of carbon dioxide that's entering into the atmosphere is going to cause changes to the Earth. We're all familiar with the concept of climate change. We have seen some very significant boundaries that have been crossed. Last year, 2023, we actually exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius average warming in addition to the current temperatures. So when we see that increase above 1.5, that is a big alarm bell for scientists, because they had previously said, if we go above 1.5, we don't know what are all the possible disruptions that will occur. So we know there's going to be drought. We know there's going to be natural disasters. We know the oceans are warming and becoming more acid-based, so that is harming life in the oceans. So as we see these trends, we know they're happening. 1.5 was the target, and we're now actually past that. So at the same time that I've been teaching students about sustainable business, I've also been hearing from them about their views of business and their views of capitalism. And so this is even among business students. I just started hearing really negative views of capitalism. And it made me wonder what's happening overall, and what are we seeing more generally in our culture? So we're seeing actually at this point, so in 2022, in a Pew Research Center poll, 57% of Americans still view capitalism positively. So overall majority. But that's actually down from 2019 pretty significantly. And we see this across even our very polarized state of the world. So Democrats, less than a majority of Democrats view that positively, which is down from 2019. And even among Republicans, we see the percentage of folks who think that capitalism is a force for good is going down. Now, here's a number that really grabs me as somebody who's working in the classroom and working with students and young people, is that only 40% of folks aged 18 to 29 view capitalism positively. And that number goes down for each of those ages. So the younger that folks get, the less positively they view capitalism overall. So of course, as a scientist, that makes me wonder, what do they not like? right? So if we don't view capitalism positively, we must think that we know what capitalism is in order to not view it that way. So I started looking and doing research about 4 or 5 years ago just into this whole notion of capitalism. What does it mean when students say they don't like it? What are they really talking about? So I said, okay, I've got to come up with a definition of capitalism. And here's what I found. I couldn't figure one out because there actually is no singular definition of capitalism. I do find there's a couple of economic principles that tend to go along with every conversation about capitalism. So these are characteristics that we can look at. And there's 2 primary economic characteristics. One is the existence of markets, and those markets are ones in which buyers and sellers exercise free choice. So laws of demand and supply set prices and the availability of goods in the market. So that's probably the most common way that people would describe capitalism, and what their sense is when they say whether they like it or don't like it, or the existence of markets. And then the second piece has to do with private property. So if we think about the ownership of private property and the folks who own that property having the ability to direct how goods and services are used, that's another key component of capitalism. But we actually see when we look at this overall across the world and all of the economies in the world, if you were to say, let's go out and study whether capitalism is good and bad, we'd have to isolate it, right, to be able to study whether it's good or bad. But what we find is that there's actually no example of pure capitalism. Nobody out there is running an experiment where they're saying, let's solely run our entire socio-economic system based on these 2 principles. What we actually tend to do in our societies is that we use law and we use regulation to balance how much we want to have a market dictating the flow of goods and services and how those goods and services are exchanged, and how much we want to achieve certain specific social outcomes. So let me talk about a couple of market failures and ways in which we use law to correct them. So we know that there are publicly available goods. If you think about clean air or clean water, those things are available to everybody who has access to them. And there's no price tag associated with it. So if you were pricing goods and services in a market, you would have to price the air and the water if you really wanted to accurately use the tenets that we had just talked about. But in fact, in most scenarios, clean air and clean water, they don't have a price tag associated with them. And so right away, we know that if we want to apply some kind of capitalist structure to that, we'd have to create a price signal, and we'd have to create something to regulate that flow of supply and demand. And if we didn't, we could find that those public goods could get exhausted. So we use the law to deal with that market failure, or not in some cases. Other examples of ways in which we use the law. If you think about private property, we can't have private property unless there's some regulatory framework that says, if you take my stuff, I have a way to get it back. Or if I sign a contract with you, I can enforce that contract. All of these are rules that exist in law, and they're created to actually support and allow for that capitalist structure to work. So what we see, and I'm a lawyer, so of course I'm looking at all of these legal structures, and what we're seeing is that it's the law that's creating the structure to balance how we want the markets to operate in society and the types of social outcomes we want to have. So I mentioned that all economies are mixed economies. So when we look out across the world, we see the United States having some aspects of what we consider capitalism. So some aspects where we have the markets in which the public just chooses what they want to buy, how much they want to pay for it. And then we also have structures in place that are the opposite of that. They're government regulations that limit how goods can be sold and purchased in the market. And we can see that in the United States, obviously in the healthcare system. You see it in public transportation. We see it in the way that we regulate our utilities. But it's there in a lot of somewhat invisible ways as well. So we think about the way that the agricultural sector is regulated. We can look at how we regulate the sort of basic social services. All of those things are examples of where we don't have a pure capitalist economy, we have a mixed economy. And then we can look out across the globe and we can say, you know what, everybody's doing this. It's not just the US. So we can look at certain economies and say, well, that's primarily a communist or a centrally regulated economy, but they do a little capitalism on the side as well. So when we look at Russia and we look at China, and we look at some of these big countries, they have actually strong aspects of their economy that are also capitalist. And all of these countries are finding ways to try to balance two things. One is, what's the benefit of the market? So markets can create innovation. They can allow us to have competition. That competition can encourage people to act in socially desirable ways. We want people to work hard. We want them to feel like that hard work is rewarded. We think about the vaccines that we developed for COVID-19 and the way that there were for intellectual property protections in place. So the law protected the ability of the companies who design those vaccines to get recovery and to benefit from designing those vaccines. So we can think about how markets can spur really good things. And then on the other side, we can think about how regulation can limit the undesirable things, the antitrust problems when one entity has control over a huge part of the market. We can think about concerns about environmental protection and the use of public goods and trying to make sure those public goods aren't degraded to the point that they can't be accessed. So all economies are balanced, and we use law and regulation to create that balance. That's really the outcome of a lot of years of research for me. All of these different tools that the law provides us and that regulation provides us are opportunities for us to live out policy choices. So in the end, when I talk to people about capitalism and I talk about what sustainable capitalism might look like, I think it's just really important to take away that capitalism is a series of policy choices. It's built on some very basic economic principles, but in the end, the way that our economy actually functions is going to be in the balance of the different types of incentives that we use. And so we have control over it. Capitalism does not control us. Our destiny is not written into the stars. So I want to encourage everybody to think about how can we use regulation to achieve the outcomes that we want and how we can create a more sustainable future. Thank you.